I'm Theresa Skorseth. We have a couple of very special guests here today for a Latin American update. We have Larry Fisk, who has been with us before to tell us what's going on in the southern part of our hemisphere, and Doug Olson, who's also very knowledgeable about these things. So we're going to have a Latin American update, and I want to start with Venezuela. Tomorrow is March 5th. It is the anniversary of the death of Hugo Chavez. And so let's find out what's been going on since then. I think the last time we talked, Larry, he was in the hospital and very close to dying.
2 years ago tomorrow, Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela, died after a fairly extensive battle with cancer. In the 2 years since, well, before he went to Cuba for his surgery, for his last surgery, well, he actually flew back from Cuba, went on TV and told his people, if anything happens to me, if I'm not able to continue as president, it's clear, as plain as the full moon, vote for Vice President Maduro, Nicolas Maduro, to be your constitutionally elected president. An election followed the death of Hugo Chavez. President Maduro won by less than 2%, but he won. That was surprisingly small. I believe a lot of Chavistas, supporters of Chavez, were just so deeply in mourning and confused and upset, and the polls had indicated Maduro would win easily, that they simply didn't vote. Following that election of Maduro, the opposition claimed fraud, which they always do, although Venezuela, as confirmed by Jimmy Carter, probably the foremost electoral observer in the world, as the best electoral system in the world, and I was able to observe it quite closely and was an official observer of the recount of Chavez's last presidential election, and they've got just a wonderful system. A very large percentage of people registered to vote, and a very large proportion turned out to vote. Internationally acclaimed as a very reliable system, easy to vote. So anyway, the opposition, which has lost almost every election since 1998, claims fraud every time, and the opposition candidate called on people to take to the streets because of the so-called fraud, and basically incited them to violence, and there were a number of deaths and property destruction and such and so forth. That was brought under control, but during this whole 2-year period there's been an attack against the Maduro government. Basically, the Venezuelan opposition, which is controlled by the oligarchy, the rich interests of the country that used to control everything before Hugo Chavez was elected president, with the backing and financing and tutelage of the U.S. State Department and other U.S. agencies. So for 2 years there's been a media campaign, international media campaign led by the United States to discredit the Maduro government. Last year, last January, a movement started, what they called La Salida, the exit, to try to get the president to resign. And basically a bunch of paid thugs would go into the streets, usually with hoods over their faces, maybe Molotov cocktails. They'd cut down trees, block major roads. The number of killings, they strung wires across roads. 2 motorcyclists were basically beheaded running into these cords strung across the road, and trying to make the country shut down, be ungovernable. When the government, which really showed a lot of restraint, came in with the National Guard and started quelling these disturbances and clearing streets, there was some further violence. I think 40 people were killed in all. A few of those actually were killed by the police of the National Guard, but most of them were, if those killed were police, National Guard, passers-by. In response to that, the U.S. government claimed that Maduro is a major human rights violator and basically continued to back the La Salida, that the president should resign. At the same time, there's been an economic attack, tax on the currency. The major corporations in the country have been hoarding and holding back basic consumer goods from the market. So when people go to the stores, there's long lines to try to cause discontent among the population. Once again, to try to bring down the government, Maduro. However, President Maduro, as President Chavez before him indicated he would be, is an excellent president, an excellent leader. His background is as a union leader. He was a bus driver. He was a leader of the bus drivers union, and stands solidly with the working people. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, Venezuela's economy has been hit by the fall in oil prices. Venezuela's income, its international currency income, is almost exclusively from selling its oil. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, 300 billion barrels of conventional oil, and a whole lot more of oil sands, so considerably more than Saudi Arabia. Interesting to note that many of the countries that the U.S. government sees as enemies is basically attacking perpetually our oil producers. Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Russia. These are all countries that are highly dependent on oil production, have a lot of oil, and it's no coincidence that they are the targets of U.S. aggression. The good news in the situation in Venezuela is that people that support the government have a high level of consciousness. They know that the conditions in the country are not the fault of the government, that they're being caused by, external forces. Just in the last couple of weeks, a coup attempt was uncovered. The Venezuelan intelligence service did apparently an excellent job. There was a plan to use small militarized aircraft to attack the presidential palace and other sites in the capital city and other places in the country, and there was a statement issued that there should be an interim government, and that the same old folks that used to run the country would take over and then apply to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank for loans and put Venezuela back in the place it used to be, which is dependent on the structures basically that the U.S. controls in the world. But this was uncovered. One of the leaders and organizers was jailed. He's now in jail awaiting trial. And he's the mayor of a section of the capital city. A long time operative for the oligarchy in the country. So anyway, 2 years ago tomorrow, Hugo Chavez died, and when Hugo Chavez died, I'll quote Sean Penn, the famous actor who was a personal friend of Chavez. He said, when Chavez died, I lost a friend that I was privileged to have, and the American people lost a friend they didn't know they had. One thing Hugo Chavez did for the United States of America is the oil company Citgo, which belongs to the government of Venezuela, was the only oil company willing to give free heating oil aid to poor Americans. And probably about over the last 10 years, about 1 million American families have received heating oil free from the Venezuelan government.
In fact, Larry, doesn't the state of Massachusetts have a contract with Citgo to provide that oil?
I believe they do, and according to Winona LaDuke, people on the reservation here in Minnesota benefit from that program. Hugo Chavez was also the world's foremost peace activist. He was one of the first people of any prominence to speak out against the Afghan war, was always traveling the world speaking about peace, necessity to adhere to international law. He was the major advocate in the world in our time, in the 21st century, for social justice, social and economic justice. And he was basically the leader of a Latin American movement for Latin American countries to integrate, to defend their sovereignty, to promote solidarity and true democracy. As I said, Venezuela had they have a wonderful democratic system. One thing I liked about it when I was there during the Chavez's last presidential election, I met a person who worked for the Electoral Council. Now, in the Latin American countries, there's a separate branch of government that runs elections, and he was doing something else that day. I met him helping out in a different function, but his usual job was to monitor the media, because electoral propaganda is controlled. You can have ads on TV, but a limited number, limited total time. You can have your political stuff in newspapers, but it's limited how much that you can have. So you're not inundated with political messages and scare campaigns, etc. Everybody knows the positions that the different parties have, but you're not overwhelmed, and money doesn't outright buy your elections.
Right.
So anyway, in losing Hugo Chavez, the world lost a real a light, really. The guy had an amazing skill set. He was truly a great communicator. I was just listening to the radio from Venezuela this morning, and they were replaying some of his speeches, the speech when he was going off for his surgery, and other speeches that he made to the people. And he was a person of such enthusiasm, optimism, his belief in people, and that we truly can build a decent society was infectious, and he was beloved throughout the world. So the loss was truly great. And then the current attacks on Venezuela are really attacks. Venezuela is a linchpin for this whole movement in Latin America, because with their resources of oil, with Chavez's generosity, they were helping dozens of other countries. Chavez set up an organization called Petrocaribe to distribute petroleum to countries throughout the Caribbean region at very, let's say, he couldn't, being a member of OPEC, they can't give the oil away, they can't reduce the price, but they would delay the payments at very low interest rate that would make the petroleum available to these countries that might otherwise be dependent on Exxon. And then he also helped finance them building their own refineries, so they could become independent from energy companies. Another thing that Chavez did, along with Fidel Castro of Cuba, they set up a program called Operation Milagro to take care of people with vision problems in Latin America. Totally free. The doctors came from Cuba, the money from Venezuela, and as of last year, I believe over 3 million people have had surgery, eye surgery, usually for cataract removal and such. This is the type of generosity and solidarity that the man put forward.
I'd like to mention a personal example too, what, as far as, what President Chavez himself directly. I mean, do you remember, when was it, about 3-4 years ago, I think there was some flooding or some natural disaster in Caracas, and there were many families displaced by that. And he invited the displaced families, come on in, you can live with me in the presidential palace. I remember it. Yeah, imagine President Obama doing that in the White House. Yeah, he actually invited these displaced families to come live with him.
When there was a threat of flooding, I remember he went to one place and, a poor village, and he said, "You're getting out of here. It's dangerous here." And he brought trucks and he said, "Old people, women and children first, get on the trucks, we're getting you all out of here, you're in danger." He was just intimately connected with his people. On his last campaign, he did a campaign tour where he started his hometown, which is out west in the plains, and just drove all the way to the capital city, stopping in every little town and talking to people. And the way people related to him was as if he were their uncle or their cousin. He just had a very intimate, warm way of relating to people. This fantastic sense of humor, a real, empathy for common people. He himself came from fairly humble circumstances. Was raised by his grandmother. Sold candies she made in the street to help make ends meet. In fact, she made these little confections that were in the shape of a spider. So, he still has a nickname of Arañero, Spider-Man, was one of his nicknames. But a guy that just was deeply rooted in the people, and a person who had he was extremely well educated and well read, and had a broad knowledge of the history and culture of not only his country but of Latin America, and reached out to unite people. And so anyway, Venezuela being this key is why they're continually under attack, because by attacking Venezuela, the United States hopes to undermine that movement for solidarity, because the United States has for a very long time been the dominant power in the region, and wants to maintain that, and does not want to see this movement that's happened. Chavez was instrumental in forming an organization called UNASUR, the Union of South American Countries. Another ALBA, which is the most progressive Latin American and Caribbean countries, are in a mutual self-help organization. Very, very progressive, strongly, fighting poverty. And another organization, CELAC, which contains all the nations of the Americas except the United States and Canada.
It's an alternative to the Organization of American States, which
has been controlled by the United States.
From the very beginning in 1948.
And while they've been attacked in the last 2 years, and meanwhile the U.S. has been imposing sanctions on Venezuela, they're terrible human rights. Now, Colombia, right next door, which has been a horrible human rights violator, the former president Uribe, when he was president and strongly supported by the United States, they had a scandal called the false positive scandal, where the army was kidnapping poor young men off the streets, murdering them, dressing up as if they were guerrilla fighters to show that they had a better kill ratio because there's a civil war going on in Colombia. So atrocious human rights violations, and the U.S. not only didn't criticize, condemn, and put sanctions against them, but supplied them with billions of dollars a day.
I've heard that, when it comes to unions, Colombia is the most dangerous country in the world to be a trade union organizer. Many of them.
Or a journalist.
Journalists, many of them have been killed, disappeared, it's terrible. I mean, they rank very low on human rights indexes. Same with Honduras. You were in Honduras, you saw the elections back in November 2013. According to the U.S. State Department, these were good, honest elections, but firsthand from what you experienced.
They were corrupt elections. People were intimidated by different mechanisms to vote for the government candidate. People threatened with having their child support cut off, and other ways. People going to the polls and being told they couldn't vote because they were dead. And all those people that I talked to and my associates talked to were all from the opposition party. They were dead, they couldn't vote. Nobody from the pro-government party had that problem. So and political repression, including violence, has continued against minority groups and activists in Honduras, but the United States government does not condemn Honduras.
Never.
Condemns Venezuela as a human rights violator, but Venezuela is actually a country that is widely respected throughout the world for its support for human rights, which was shown. They came up to have possibility to be a temporary member of the UN Security Council. The U.S. ran a campaign to try to get countries to vote against them, but overwhelmingly they were elected to the Security Council seat because they're widely respected throughout the world.
What is the United States agenda in South and Central America? Why does the United States support who it supports and try to compromise others?
Well, if we just take Venezuela for an example, the petroleum, which I've just told you is the largest petroleum reserve in the world, used to be controlled by the large international oil companies. Now, after Chavez was elected, he was elected in '98 to the presidency in '99, and I believe it was 2002. There was a strike where the top-down strike to close down the oil industry, which devastated the economy, to try to get rid of Chavez. Luckily, the workers came back, took over the industry, and then subsequently Chavez nationalized that oil. He paid the companies, and most companies accepted it at market price, but the oil now belongs to the people of Venezuela, and is the money from that oil that funds free public education through university level, and funds free universal health care. I believe I've told you before, I was in a healthcare facility with my daughter and a friend in Venezuela, and I said to the intake nurse, if my friend were sick, would you take care of him? And he said, well, what's wrong with him? I said, oh, he's been having a little diarrhea. Grabbed him by the shoulder, took him back, saw a doctor, had lab tests, wrote him a prescription. No money involved. Foreigners. Because in Venezuela, healthcare is considered to be a human right. So that money that used to be, that oil, and the money from oil that used to be controlled by Exxon and other oil companies, is now used to promote the health of Venezuelan people. It's estimated that since this universal free healthcare, that 2 million lives have been saved from free universal healthcare. So that's the agenda. The U.S. government agenda is an agenda to push the interests of corporations and banks to control the wealth of the world. And as we know, the extremely wealthy corporations and individuals continue to become more and more wealthy. That's the plan. They always want more money, no amount is enough. They want to control Iraqi oil. Why did we make war against Iraq? Iraq's oil had been nationalized. Iraq's oil was used to fund a free universal health care system, free education through university level, and the government of Iraq was never going to turn that oil back over to the companies. That's why Iraq was targeted.
Same thing with Libya.
Why did we target Libya? High quality, cheap to produce oil that was partly being used to fund education and healthcare in Libya.
Yeah, Libya.
Why is Iran viewed as an enemy? Because they do something so terrible in the world? No, because they control their own oil, which used to be controlled by American and British petroleum companies.
So America is following the model of the dog who, if it can't eat something, will bury it. If there's no profit, you just stop it.
Well, we've seen this before throughout history. I mean, we've seen this happen in Guatemala with the overthrow of President Arbenz by the CIA in 1954. It happened in Brazil in 1864. President Goulart, I believe his name was, 1973. I mean, we see a lot of history repeating itself. President Allende. In 1965, when it looked like the junta in the Dominican Republic was about to be overthrown, the U.S. sent in Marines, got it rubber stamped by the OAS. One of the well, what was it, Paraguay and Nicaragua sent troops to help the U.S., two of the most repressive governments in the region at that time. The 1980s, Larry can talk about what he saw in Nicaragua firsthand. You know, he had the first Sandinista government doing wonderful things, helping the Nicaraguan people. You know, the U.S. instigates the Contra War. You know, these brutal thugs who, you know, did terrible things. And, you know, although they never had support, they were never able to hold any towns or anything for long, but they caused enough havoc that eventually the Nicaraguan people said, we'll never have peace unless we have to vote out the Sandinista government, who thankfully, you know, in 2006, you know, were elected. And 2011, President Ortega's, oh yeah, and they're doing great things there. But we've seen this throughout, and see, that's why when people, you know, in the mainstream press, when they accused President Chavez of being paranoid, or now President Maduro, and they're saying, well, we got all this evidence about plots. Oh no, this is just baloney on their part. There's no evidence. There's no coup. Well, we know in 2002 that the U.S. government supported the coup against President Chavez. You know, they removed him from power, you know, the oligarchy for, you know, 2 days. I mean, this is a miracle that he came back, because most of the time when a president's overthrown in a coup, they don't come back, but he came back.
Hundreds of thousands of people, Caracas, the poor people live up in the hills, hundreds of thousands, mostly women, came down into the streets demanding the return of their president, and then loyal members of the armed forces rescued him, brought him back to power. So yeah, that was a great day.
It's a miracle. And yet, like Larry mentioned, the oil worker strike, there was a recall referendum, the U.S. constantly interfering in the elections. There's a whole agency, I think we must mention it, the National Endowment for Democracy. It's funded by Congress, and they are allied with a bunch of, you know, NGOs, non-governmental organizations like Freedom House, sometimes Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. And the NED's whole mission is to replace governments that the U.S. doesn't like with governments that the U.S. can dominate, control. And they do this all over the world, and they've been interfering in Venezuela's elections for a long time. And, you know, same with Nicaragua and all the other progressive Latin American countries.
Yeah, so you just have a couple minutes.
Yeah.
I'd like to just mention a couple of the very positive things that have gone on in Latin America.
Good.
Like in Venezuela, for instance, when Chavez became president, about 66% of the population lived in misery. It's now down to this year 5.5% in extreme poverty, down to 5.5%.
So much better than
Hunger
the
basically eradicated. And even those people that remain poor, remember, they do have education, they do have free health care, and there's a government program that in the next few years will have supplied every poor family with a new unit of dignified housing. So even though they're very poor, their lives are greatly improved. Nicaragua, since President Ortega got finally re-elected in 2006, and I was down to observe his re-election in 2011. Things have improved vastly in Nicaragua, with people eating better, being educated, also free health care. You go there now and it's a very happy, enthusiastic, hopeful place to be. By the way, over 250,000 Americans went to Nicaragua as tourists last year. Go there. Don't go to some tourist trap in Mexico. Go to Nicaragua, beautiful country, quite safe, wonderful police force, a government that's working with the people to improve things at every turn. Let's say a few things about Cuba. I met 6 Cuban doctors in 3 different places in Venezuela. I interviewed 4 of them. One of them, I said, "Are you anxious to go back home?" And he said, "Man, Cuba is so nice. You can go anywhere, day or night, and you don't have to be afraid." What a wonderful accomplishment. You have a society with very low violent crime. You can go anywhere, anytime. You don't have to be afraid. 0 homelessness. Great medical care system. Highly educated. One of the most highly educated populations in the world. Quite environmentally conscious at this time. And a country that remains a poor country, but as I said, they have the Latin American School of Medicine, where in 2013 there were almost 20,000 students are enrolled.
Wow.
These are all getting a medical education for free to go back to practice medicine in poor communities throughout Latin America, some Africa, and some Asia.
And I know you've said in the past that the Cuban physicians are, oh, I'm sorry, we have to go. But we will, we'll come back. We're going to do another part with Larry Fisk and Doug Olson about domestic and international policies. And so we'll see you then. Thanks for watching.